Welcome to this Payments Unpacked podcast. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Richard from the embedded finance provider Lerex. Richard, thank you for joining me today. Before we get into any detail about the conversation, it'd be really helpful to get a brief introduction about who you are and who Lerex are.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Who I am, I think I'm a business brain with a strong technology background, or either way, a technologist with a business brain, whichever way you want to look at it. But I spent the first 20 years of my career building financial platform for tier one institutions, banks, stock exchanges, brokers. And over the last 10 years, I've always loved business and the kind of the thrive of the deal and the commercial aspect. So over the last 10 years, I've been more on the business side, still with a foot in technology. And currently, I'm CEO for Lerex, which, like you said, is, I guess you could call us as well, banking as a service provider. So we allow a number of institutions within the UK and the EA to just access financial services for a number of various different reasons.
Fantastic. It's always good to get just a little bit of a brief background about the person to understand who they are and where they come from and the firm that they're with. We had a chat last week before about a couple of things that we might cover on this podcast. And you immediately came up with two really interesting thoughts. And I thought, that's great. Somebody with a passion about a couple of particular subjects, let's cover them on the podcast. And, without any further ado, the first of those ideas you came up with was around a concept called money streaming. And you said you thought that our kids would be streaming money like we're today currently streaming music and movies. Well, the fact that you used that phrase, money streaming, certainly grabbed my attention. So let's start off with a definition, Richard. What is money streaming?
So I think the definition I would put is obviously exchanging money as a stream, and that doesn't tell you much. I think what I mean is literally exchanging money in real time, and the same as you'd be watching a movie or listening to an audio. So in practice, if I was to look at my, balance and my wallet balance during the stream, that would be decreasing in real time, constantly changing, or increasing if I'm being paid, through a stream. But it's really that's really kind of the concept of, there is a start and a stop, but it's not per segment. It's really a continuous exchange of money.
Okay, and let's hope that this continuous exchange of money in my account is the balance going up quicker than it's going down. But that would be great, wouldn't it? And I guess that if that's your definition of money streaming, I've got a why question for you. Why do you think it's needed?
I think it's needed for a number of reasons. First of all, is customer usage is changing. I mean, it's bluntly obvious. So my son, who is now 7 years old, doesn't consume the same as we used to. He's very used as everything on demand, doesn't really think about it, just start watching something on a video streaming service and then stops. I think with the growth of the gig economy, that's now being applied as well into earnings, and people being more and more used to receiving their income in different ways. So I think the customer demand is changing, and I think we know that when there is a disconnect between the way we consume a service and the way we pay for it, it creates friction, because the customer might not be that comfortable, or the price there's difficulties in both sides. So I think with the usage evolving, we're going to need to find a way to also evolve the way we pay for it. That's one of the reasons. I think there are other reasons. It's at the moment we're still, for some of the services, it's still difficult to charge appropriately using the current method that we have. I'm thinking about newspaper, news article website and any type of content website. I mean, you remember a number of years ago which I think created effectively was kind of the start for something like cryptocurrency. We discussed micropayment and how you can exchange micropayment. That's still not quite there. And I remember at the time, some news website were charging £1 per article you read, for example. Sometimes was too much, sometimes was not enough. I mean, so defining that the price of that piece sometimes is very difficult, and money streaming could help with that. And I think the third reason for it is the opportunity it creates. So as a provider, the more choice I give to my customer in their way to pay, and the more I allow them to align with actual usage, and the easier for me is going to be to convince them to become paid customers for me. And one example of that, which could really benefit in money streaming, I think, is the whole software as a service industry. So, often we see freemium, software which has free membership, maybe a silver and a gold, and you're always like, well, I'm using 99% of the free, but I want that one feature which is part of the gold, right? Am I going to pay, upgrade? I've never kind of upgraded for it. But if I could be paying, like, okay, I'm using 10 minutes of the gold feature, I'm paying for those 10 minutes. And, maybe those 10 minutes pro rata are quite expensive, but I'm just paying for 10 minutes, right? And the more I'm using it, then I might convert into, a monthly or a yearly license. But to start with, I'm already paying for my usage. So I think that's the reason why we are going to need it.
Really interesting background. You talk about the concept of micropayments in the context of some of conversations a few years ago. It just reminds me of some conversations I had in the late 90s as a junior product manager at Barclays when we were trying to find a micropayment product at that time. So it's been a challenge that's been around for a long time. Let me ask you a question. It's perhaps a bit of a build on what you've already said, but it's quite a blunt question. You talk about money streaming. Come on, Richard, why do we need yet another payment method?
Well, believe me, I'm not saying that lightly. I don't want either to have yet another one. But I think, if my prediction is right and that usage is creating real value, we can't do that with what we have today. So you could go back and say, okay, I'm watching a movie for 20 minutes and then I stop because I don't like it and I only want to pay for 20 minutes. Yeah, you could have the streaming platform charging me, let's say, 6p a minute. But if we use the current schemes and method of payment, that would probably result in 6p settlement on my kind of bank. Really wants that. It would be very expensive as well to process. So I think we can't really have the streaming of the money without, a new payment method. I think the current payment method wouldn't really support it. And an important aspect in money streaming is that it's often going to be used. I mean, often with payment, it's used in situations where both parties don't necessarily trust, each other. They're trusting the payment scheme. So there needs to be also an element of, as I was saying, the balance increases or decreasing. Needs to be an element of trust that when the stream completes, that money is going to be exchanged, right? If I'm the payer, I have the money available to pay you. And if you're receiving the money, you're going to get it. So I think that there needs to be something that really going to reassure people that the exchange of money will happen at some point.
I'm quite interested in some of those use cases. We've got used to, perhaps because of the absence of being able to do micropayments and smaller payments, we've got used to all you can eat options of Netflix, of reading a newspaper, so a full fat subscription. You've talked about some potential money streaming ideas in terms of perhaps our use, maybe buying that one film, maybe buying that one article from a magazine publisher or a newspaper. But let's think about, I'm interested in your ideas for future use cases. So your son's 7 years old, 5 years time, probably a bit earlier, he's going to be looking to consume things digitally in a way. So if we think about the concept of money streaming, your son when he's 11 or 12, what sort of things might he be using money streaming for?
I think all sorts of things. So obviously audio and movies is no-brainer. Everyone will get that. I think for me, the idea started when a couple of years ago, I had a subscription to all those platforms. You can name one, content, I had a subscription. And I wanted to kind of rectify that. And one of them, I was just using it every month. I think if I had the money streaming at the time, I would have kept the subscription. I would be saying, okay, well, maybe I'm paying a bit more pro rata, but I'm going to pay when I use it. And who knows, maybe I would have gone back into increasing that membership. Today, 2 years later, I'm still not paying anything to that platform. So I think audio and movies is one obvious one, but then you can apply it to, I've mentioned software, which I think is a strong one as well. But then you could go into, car park, number of time I'm going to park for an hour because I'm going to see, well, actually recently I parked for an hour. I got the date wrong. I parked for an hour because I went to my GP. I arrived, was on the wrong date, and I paid for that hour. I think if I had the opportunity to really pay as I enter, have a stream starting, and then as I exit, having that exchange of money, it becomes much more embedded into our day-to-day life, which is really where, funny enough, the embedded payment angle comes in. But you also have the gig economy. Why not being paid as a stream, right? If I'm contributing, especially around video content, as someone is doing something, getting paid for their usage. There is, and there are others. I think there are a number of I think if and when it takes off, there's going to be a vast number of use cases for money stream.
Fantastic. I mean, maybe even Payments Unpacked, the paid for version, we could move to, instead of an all-you-can-eat version, you could have a money streaming version and just pick the articles that you want to read. Look, really interesting in terms of money streaming. Just listening to you really does show that I think that, in the coming weeks and months, we're going to hear more and more about this subject. And let's see how that subject unravels and unfolds and what opportunities it brings in a society that is so much more digital, and we need more options than all you can eat, all you consume type options. So thank you for sharing your views on that. I just want to shift, just for the second half of this podcast, shift a little bit and pick up on the second thing that you mentioned to me when we spoke. And that was about what you believe to be the rising gap between compliance and technology and the risk that poses. So I think if you're going to make a statement like that, the first question, Richard, has to be, what are the challenges with the current model?
That's one I really like, and maybe a bit of a controversial one. So, we'll go for it. I think if I look at the market today, especially EMIs and those kind of banking as a service platform, I think most of the providers on the market today are technology provider, right? You look at their website, they're selling APIs, they're selling ways to integrate technology. It's all about the technology. And yes, there is a very strong regulatory and compliance angle and operational angle, but fundamentally they rely on technology. And I think what's happening is too often technologists don't fully understand compliance. They're going to understand some element of it, but not necessarily into detail. And compliance team don't fully understand how technology can be used and abused. Most people I know, and I'm still doing a bit of work as a technology advisor. That's where I kind of see, some of those challenges. And everyone goes through, security is well understood, and everyone goes through the black box pen testing or the white box pen testing to cover security issue. But that kind of security tends to be more black and white than compliance. So the compliance piece isn't always addressed through security. It's not necessarily a security issue, it's really a compliance issue. And those banking as a service platform fairly rarely do a proper audit of the technology of the customer connected to them. So I think, that's the challenges I'm seeing today in effectively selling a technology service without really, and having a compliance responsibility and not marrying the two very well.
And you talked about the gap, but you talked about the rising gap. So why at the moment is it becoming more of an issue?
It's a good question. I mean, is it becoming more of an issue now, or has it always been there? That's a good question. I think, the adoption of those services are still fairly new in the grand scheme of things. All the fintech starting, we see more and more of them. So I think The problem has probably always potentially been there. I mean, again, it's the last, 10 years, it's a fairly small window, but the problem probably always been there, but because it's being consumed more and more, we're seeing problem more and more. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about is actually have two examples. And I've seen some pretty big problem happening, but the two simple examples I can take just to kind of put it into the picture is one platform I saw, and when I talk about the term abuse, I don't necessarily mean it could be people doing it on purpose, but it's also doing it by mistake, not really taking the right precaution. But one example I've seen is a platform where at the time where you were creating a customer through their API, so a new end client through their API, obviously they were validating the email, they were validating the phone number, making sure the phone number belongs to the. But then there was a functionality, a feature of the platform where you could change the phone number, and that wasn't protected as well. So effectively, if I was let's say I'm the CTO and I'm badly intended, let's say, you're one of our customers and I want to steal your money. What I could do is effectively onboard you normally, but then change your phone number to mine. And I could do that without, strong verification. And then I can start to do the payment. It's a very simple case, which I'm sure everyone has covered now, but that's one of the examples of things that could go wrong if you don't think too much about it. Another one which I've seen, which was more difficult to detect, was a platform that was using both payment and card usage. So when the payment came in, everything was fine. But on the card side, they misplaced the decimal point. So they were charging pence instead of charging pound. So I could make a £10 deposit and then spend £5, and my £5 would be 5p. So effectively, as an end user, I probably wouldn't be that, I'd probably be quite happy about that. So it created a mismatch, and it took them some time to really see that, because one of the challenges as well is in their reconciliation. The reconciliation were using the same piece of code, so had the same problem. So the reconciliation was fine, but there was still a problem happening. So that's what I'm talking about around, technologists not necessarily always understanding what could go wrong, not being checked properly, maybe not the right question being asked to start with.
Okay, so you've highlighted to me what you think might be a rising gap, what the challenge, what the problem might be. From your perspective and given your experience, how can payment firms solve that challenge?
I think they can do it in one of two ways. They can not release control. And that's more the Lerex model where, we don't allow our customers to, we can caricature, but kind of do anything, right? So we take charge of all those problematics. So we're still exposed internally, but it's easier to control when it's internal than when it's external. So that's more within our process. And then for our customer, it's quite safe, and it's quite a nice comfort blanket to have, to know that they can't do anything wrong. Because again, every CTO and imagine CEO within an organization, one, they ask what goes wrong if one of my main developer goes rogue. Why if he wants to abuse the platform? What if he wants to steal money? How do I protect against that? So it does happen. I've seen cases of police coming into offices, removing, people. But when it's internally, it's easier to control. Imagine the same risk if you start trusting your customers. So Lerex takes an approach of kind of protecting against that. The second way that firms can address it is to manage it properly, is to maybe have specific roles that cover both technology and compliance, and embed those roles or those teams, right into the process, because technology, sometimes architecture decisions have been made that are very difficult to change. So sometimes you have a problem, you identify it, but fixing it can be extremely expensive and extremely difficult. So I think those type of questions and needs to be there right from the beginning of the platform, of the technology implementation, whether it's an integration, a build, or whatever it is. I think there needs to be new roles created to really bridge the gap. and make sure all of that are being addressed, thought about, the right questions are being asked, and that needs to be embedded within the technology implementation cycle. And then they also need to audit their client properly to make sure that can be done. I mean, it's not a new concept. I spent a lot of time in the stock exchange, type platform, and they all go through what you call a process of certification to just make sure that everything works well. I haven't seen that used that widely within payments, but that's one way you can protect against it.
Perfect. Really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Richard. You know what? We've reached the end of our time together already. So, huge level of thanks to you, Richard, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on money streaming and thinking about that gap between compliance and technology and the risks that it poses. So thank you for sharing those thoughts with you. Folk might want to reach out to you, Richard. What's the best way to make contact?
LinkedIn is a good way. So Richard Ney. I was a fairly early adopter, so I have the LinkedIn Richard Ney, all together. But yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily.
Perfect. So please reach out to Richard if you want to follow up on the conversation. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast. And while you're doing that, also subscribe to the Payments Unpacked newsletter at payments-unpacked.com.
Thank you.